Here we go. Hey guys, a absolute pleasure today. I have for you an unbelievable guest. Truly honored to be speaking to him. Let me, before I cede the floor to him, introduce him. This is Dan Dennett. He's university professor and Austin B. Fletcher Professor of Philosophy and the co-director of the Center for Cognitive Studies at Tufts University. The author of, holy moly, over 400 articles, and if I counted correctly, I might have made a mistake. You'll correct me if I have. 17 books, including, I won't list them all because then we'll take the whole 60 minutes for this. Breaking the Spell, Freedom Evolves, Darwin's Dangerous Idea. I checked his Google Scholar citations. Apparently I need to be more influential because he's got 78,000 plus Google Scholar citations. Pretty impressive. His forthcoming book, which I guess we'll talk about a bit today, among other things, From Bacteria to Bach and Back, The Evolution of Minds. How are you doing, Dan?
Just fine. Very good to be with you, Gad.
Yeah, likewise. So before we get going, this is a friend is asking this. There's apparently a opening available in the four Horsemen Club, and so the friend wants to know where he can send his CV for evaluation and by which date.
Actually, the Four Horsemen is a of the New Atheism is the brainchild of some journalist, we don't know who. We went along with the gag, but there's no organization and there's no way of filling that vacancy. We were originally going to be five in the first place.
Who was the fifth one?
Ayaan Hirsi Ali was going to be the fifth one, and she was in Washington and was due to come join us that day when we made the video, but she had to rush back to the Netherlands to deal with some legal matters.
Got you. Anyways, I don't think it's possible to ever replace the great position lost via Christopher Hitchens.
Hitchens was in a class by himself.
Truly, if somebody were to ask me, somebody who is a contemporary, who I regret never having had a chance to meet, I would hands down say Christopher Hitchens. Not only, of course, because of his intelligence, but the way he went about. I mean, he was an intellectual warrior, right? A thug. I mean, a guy really after my heart, because sometimes I don't pull punches, and of course, he epitomized that, right?
Yeah, he was very quick-witted, and his aggression, his rudeness was always very carefully poised and calculated. He never was gratuitously rude to anybody. He could be a great gentleman, but boy, if you slid over the line, expect to get your head handed to you.
So before we get down to some serious shop talk, I want to cover one other personal anecdote. So last year, I had a chat with Rory Factor, who reached out to me because his dad, Mohammed Factor, was a minister of finance of Lebanon who had been assassinated, and Ronnie wanted to come on my show and chat, and I chatted with him, and he was lovely. And then at that point, during our chat, he told me about his father's not surprising admiration of you and your work, and that eventually you had gone to Lebanon and you had forged a friendship. So I want you to talk briefly about that. But also I found out through Nassim Taleb that you had grown up in Lebanon. So two Lebanese stories. Can you quickly share both of those with us?
Sure. I'll work from most recent and go back from that. I met Rory Factor in Beirut when I was teaching there, and I think 2011, going back to AUB, American University of Beirut, where my father and mother had met back in the 30s, and where I'd spent some of my early youth and had wanted to go back. Been back once or twice, but I really wanted to go back and teach at AUB. It had been one of my lifetime dreams. I met Mohammed Factor, who took me to a very fancy lunch in a very fancy restaurant in the new area in Beirut, in his armored car with his chase car, which at the time amused me, and later, of course, I was horrified when that wasn't enough. He was a remarkable, gracious, intelligent man. It was my great privilege to have twice to have a lunch with him and meet him and talk with him about all sorts of things. I was just beside myself with grief when he died. And by the way, I'm hoping to go back to Lebanon next year. My father was an Islamic historian, and during World War II, he was tapped by Wild Bill Donovan to be one of the original OSS members, the forerunner of the CIA, because of his knowledge of Arabic and Arabic customs, and he traveled all over the Middle East before the war. And so he had a diplomatic cover, and after a year or so, we were all allowed to go and join him in Beirut. So from age, 3 to 5, I was in Beirut going to nursery school with Lebanese kids and French kids and a few Brits, and having wonderful adventures, living right in the heart of Beirut.
So did that allow you, were you immersed in Arabic? Did you learn Arabic? Do you speak Arabic?
I'm told that when I left age 5, my Arabic was about as fluent as my English. But my mother never had any talent for languages at all. My older sister was hard of hearing. So when we came back to the United States, there was nobody to talk with. And I lost it, although I'm told that my pronunciation is pretty good. I can usually hear Arabic, Lebanese Arabic, at least pretty well. And, I know a few hundred words, right, but I can't speak Arabic.
Perhaps my biggest regret so far as a parent, we have 2 young children, 8 and 5. We live in Montreal, Canada. And between my wife and I, we speak 5 languages. So I speak Arabic. Arabic is my mother tongue. Arabic, French fluently, English. Hebrew, I lost a bit of it, but it could quickly come back because we're Lebanese Jews. My wife also speaks Armenian because they're Lebanese Armenian. And so you would think, we've basically have the linguistic United Nations in our home, and yet we only speak to our children in English and French, precisely because the other languages, my wife and I don't share them. And therefore we each feel somewhat uncomfortable kind of leaving the other one out. And I'm so regretful of the fact that we haven't passed on all that linguistic heritage to them.
Well, at least they're bilingual, which is, of course, that's a great treasure that you're giving your kids. We brought an Armenian Lebanese nursemaid back from Beirut with us when my father was killed on a mission in 1947, and so my mother and my baby sister and my older sister and I came back to the States, and we brought a wonderful Mary Bedoyan, a Lebanese Armenian, back to Massachusetts with us. And my mother, she had 1 year to either marry an American citizen or go back to the old country. My mother very resourcefully got in touch with the 2 local rug dealers, Mr. Muradian and Mr. Budakian. And she was, Mary Bedoyan was introduced to every eligible Armenian American man in New England, just about. And about 2 days before her year was up, she married one, a very sweet man from Watertown, Massachusetts, where there's lots of Armenians, of course, Johnny Mekshian, who was a very fine auto mechanic and later owner of a very fine car dealership and garage. So she had a good life in America, which was great because she'd been a wonderful nursemaid to us in Beirut.
Wonderful. All right. Of course, we could keep talking about personal stuff for a couple more hours, but I think the viewers want us to get down to some shop talk. So I guess maybe first we could begin. You were very gracious to send me a copy of your forthcoming book, which I must admit with shame, I haven't had much of a chance to look at it, but I've at least looked at some of the titles of the chapters. And so a few things that I've noted that maybe we'll have time to get into. But before that, maybe you could give us sort of an elevator story synopsis of the book.
This is the culmination of over 50 years of research and writing on my part. What I'd come to appreciate was that there were not just intellectual, but sort of emotional resistances to some of the key elements of the way I thought you had to think about the mind and consciousness. There were people that were uncomfortable about evolution or just didn't understand evolution, and that were uncomfortable with the idea that even human beings were products of natural selection, and that didn't like the idea they also didn't like the idea of artificial intelligence because they wanted to think their minds were something mysterious and beyond material. But I saw how to put all of these things together, but it's a long, winding path. And this book puts together the basic story of evolution by natural selection, but also of how we human beings evolved to be able to interpret that story using our capacity for reasoning and reason evaluation and reason giving and challenging. And so we could reverse engineer nature, thanks to Darwin, and we can reverse engineer our own minds, thanks to Turing.
Let me stop you right there. One of the things that I wrote as something that I want to cover was your Darwin versus Turing, comparison. Yep. Precisely because if you were to ask me in my long, education, what was the one book that most affected me, other than perhaps the book that introduced me to evolutionary psychology? It would be a book that I took, an advanced computer science course that I took in my undergraduate. My undergraduate was in math computer science. It was a book on formal languages where I was introduced to all of Turing's stuff. And I mean, it was really an intellect. I mean, it was as if you were on an intellectual high. I mean, it is so profound, it is so deep that it's genuinely mind blowing. So please talk about that comparison between Darwin and Turing.
Yeah. Well, before Darwin, the common wisdom, the received view was that it took a big, fancy, intelligent thing to make a lesser thing. This is what I call the trickle-down theory of intelligent design. It took a god, in short, to design us all. Then Darwin came up with this amazing inversion. One of his critics called it a strange inversion of reasoning. He said, no, you can get wonderful design out of something which doesn't have any comprehension at all, a brute process of natural selection, which he gave enough of a good description of so that we've been able to piece it out ever since. Well, that takes care of the bird's wing, maybe, and the flowers on the stems. But what about our minds? Along comes Turing, and he does his own strange inversion. And it used to be we thought that you couldn't do arithmetic unless you understood what you were doing. And Turing says, no, you don't have to understand what you're doing. I can make a computer that can do perfect arithmetic, better than any human being can do. Doesn't understand a thing about arithmetic. It's just a machine. And he knew that was not just a hand calculator, that he could describe the building blocks out of which we could build genuine comprehension and genuine intelligence, artificial intelligence, out of this base of uncomprehending competence. So my bumper sticker, in a way, for the last few years has been competence without comprehension.
Very nice.
Which is itself a strange inversion. People think the reason we send our children to university is so that they can comprehend, so that they can then be competent. Comprehension is the source of competence. And here's both Darwin and Turing saying, no, you got that backwards. Competence is the source of comprehension. And competence without comprehension is where it all gets started. And so that's one of the main themes that runs through the book.
Now, do you feel, I think I probably can imagine what your answer is going to be, but do you think that so far historically Turing is underappreciated and that eventually that will be an autocorrective mechanism whereby he will be hailed for all of the genius that he is? Or do you think he'll forevermore sort of be a minor, notwithstanding how important he is, but that he won't be recognized in sort of public discourse the way someone like Darwin is?
Well, if I have anything to say about it, his name will be carved in the marble pediments of every library in the world, because he belongs right up there with Darwin and Einstein and Shakespeare and Jane Austen and other great intellects and great creators that we've had. He was, as you yourself just noted a minute ago, just breathtakingly intelligent. And also, he had the sort of moral imagination to think ahead and realize that he was opening up both a fantastic world of possibilities and a Pandora's box. And we're living in the age of Turing now. And one of my favorite idle fantasies is, I don't know, I think everybody probably, if you could get a time machine and bring somebody from the past into the present and show them around, who would it be?
Oh, very good.
One of my favorite is Turing, and I think he would be out of his gourd happy. But the thing is, he would have said something. What took you so long? Because he had most of the principles already worked out and was thinking way ahead.
I actually have a sad truth clip on my channel, which was originally a Psychology Today article that I had written where I played exactly this game, but it wasn't one person. It was if you could have a dinner party where you could invite 10 historical figures to your party, who would they be? And of course, I gave mine. I don't necessarily remember all of them. Unfortunately, Turing didn't make my cut, but
You should have.
I think I might have put Freud in just so that he could be bullied by the other 9, and so maybe now I need to take out Freud and put Turing instead.
Yeah. Speaking about bullying and Turing, a project which I would hope to turn to someday soon when when I don't have anything else to do, like trying to save American democracy from its current infection. There was an amazing coincidence back in the 30s in Cambridge, England, when Wittgenstein and Turing were both giving lectures on the philosophy of mathematics at the same time and attending each other's seminars. We don't know what Turing had to say in his seminars, but we do know what he had to say in Wittgenstein's seminars because he attended them, and Wittgenstein's acolytes dutifully tried to do verbatim handwritten transcripts before the days of tape recorders of what was said, and even allowing for the fact that they were all idolizing Wittgenstein. Turing, in their account, comes out to me as just whipping Wittgenstein, intimidating him, seeing beyond him. And I'd like to go sometime and just walk through those transcripts, those recorded lectures. They're just recorded in written form, and point out what a dance Turing is doing around Wittgenstein. And I think Wittgenstein realized it.
Now, I was going to leave this next question for later on, but since we're talking about Wittgenstein versus Turing, I was going to later ask you about what you think of some of the French postmodernists, Jacques Derrida, Jacques Lacan, Michel Foucault. Let me tell you what I think of it, and then you tell me if you agree. First, I think they're utter abject charlatans. They are anti-science, they're anti-reason, they're illogical. It's just make-believe verbal profundity. But I go one step further. I actually think that they knew that in the deep recesses of the privacy of their minds that they had pulled a fast one on everybody. But at that point, they were too committed, right? They had gotten a lot of accolades for that verbal diarrhea, so they couldn't extricate themselves from it. What do you think of my general position?
I think it pretty well agrees with mine. I have to admit that life's too short for me to spend much time trying out the latest French fashion in deep thought. But every time I've gone and tried, I've come back fairly disappointed. I go back to Camus and Sartre, and I thought a great deal of Camus and not much of Sartre, and everything I've learned since then tells me I got that one right. But the postmodernists, I think, are a fraud. And I'll add one little tidbit. I've actually put this in print, but you may not have run into it. I was once having a conversation with John Searle, not known to be one of my closest buddies, but we actually get along pretty well. And he told me about a meeting he had with Michel Foucault. They were pretty close. And John speaks lovely French, very old-fashioned French, lovely French. And John said, Michel, why is it that when you and I talk, I find what you say perfectly clear and interesting, but when I try to read your books, it's very hard. I just can't understand it at all. And according to Searle, Foucault answered, he says, that's because in order to be taken seriously in France, you have to put in, I don't know what he said, 25% bullshit.
I think I've heard this anecdote, yes.
Yeah, and I made up a term to describe that additive process, which I call eumeridification. And that's, yeah, I think it's done deliberately very often.
Do you feel that the sort of the zenith of that movement has already been reached and it's slowly diminishing, or do you think in the humanities and in some of the social sciences they're going as strong as always with their tsunami of bullshit?
I don't pay much attention to it, but it seems to me that it's diminishing rapidly. It's very vieux jeu and getting older every minute. I used to get a lot of students bravely trotting out some postmodernist nonsense that they'd picked up in an English class, or not in our philosophy department, but in a history class or English class or poetry class or something. And I haven't been getting much of that, but maybe they're just too afraid to try it out on me. I don't know. Right. But my sense is that we've said that enough times, and we've castigated the postmodernists enough. Now, Dick Rorty was a dear friend of mine, and he and I had a big running arm wrestle over some of the things that he said that the postmodernists liked. But I largely exempt him from my criticism, not because he was a friend of mine, but because he was really trying to be clear, and he was bravely defending what are actually quite sane versions of postmodernist thinking. And whenever I really pushed, he would say just the right thing and back off a little bit. But he tried very hard to pull me over to his side, and I didn't just resist. To tease him, I invented what I called the Rory Factor. And that is, if you want to know what somebody in Europe thinks, what you should do is read what Dick Rorty has to say about him, and then multiply that by 0.679. That is, he always sort of he wanted to overdo.
Right.
He wanted, which isn't in itself not a bad thing. I've recently written about this, that sometimes the best thing, say, a dance coach can do is say, look, you're dancing like this, and then exaggerate, caricature what you just did. Say, you don't look at that. That's crazy. And it's unfair. It's a caricature, but it makes a point. And I think judicious caricature for good purposes is no sin. I didn't always agree with Dick's purposes.
I'm sorry. Go ahead. Finish your thought.
But I learned an awful lot from Dick Rorty.
I was going to say that, and then we could move back past postmodernism in a second. We've got a lot of other things to talk about, but I guess my last point is, it seems to me, I'm speculating, but I'll take your opinion of my speculation. It seems to me that I think what postmodernists were suffering from, in a sense, is physics envy, right? In the same way that economists create ever more sophisticated mathematical models that are, frankly, most of them completely removed from any sense of reality. They completely give up any descriptive validity just so that they could be normatively valid, and therefore they can feel as though they belong at the pantheon of serious thinkers. The postmodernists were looking at the mathematicians, they're looking at Turing, and they're looking at Darwin, and they're looking at all those serious thinkers and saying, why are those bastards getting all the pretty women on campus? How can I also belong in that pantheon at that table? And therefore, I'm going to make up an impenetrable language that, in the same way that if you're not formally trained in Turing's language, by line 3 you'll be lost. well, I too can create gibberish, right? The praxis of my inverted, whatever, I can't remember the jargon, will allow me to sound profound. Could it be as simple as that? This basal need for being recognized, this pride, right? Pride is one of the 7 deadly sins that led them down this road, and it becomes a form of runaway selection.
Well, I think there's some merit to that hypothesis, but let me add a couple of factors which I think play a big role. First of all, there's the institutional difference between Europe and the Anglophone world, and that is, in the Anglophone world, students do not just sit there dutifully taking notes and being professed to, whereas on the continent, it pretty much, the professor professes ex cathedra almost from the lectern, and the students are not supposed to say no or why or how. And if in that atmosphere, it encourages a certain amount of obfuscation, because it's a cheap, easy way to impress people. But it's not just academic continental philosophers that do it. I remember discovering it even at Harvard, where I found that professors at Harvard often wanted to hide. And so they would deliberately create a sort of smokescreen of technical jargon that only the initiates could penetrate, simply because otherwise they'd be eaten alive by the students. And I had great contempt for that when I was an undergraduate at Harvard. And then when I was teaching at Harvard, not so many years later, back in 1973, for a year, I felt the urge. Harvard students eat you alive, and they will take every hour of the day, morning, noon, and night. They feel entitled to your attention, and you're supposed to be at the top of your form all day, every day. It's very exhausting, and you have to find some graceful way of ducking and hiding. And I think that's a big part of it too.
I last point on this issue, this sort of need to complicate things to appear as though you're a serious, rigorous scientist. I also see it in the behavioral sciences. So, for example, in consumer psychology, in my home base. So, as you may know, I marry evolutionary psychology with the behavioral sciences in general, but consumer behavior in particular. Most journals in consumer behavior, if you read them, are astonishingly rigorous, right? It's a 3x4x3 design. You control for this, study 1 to study 10. The end final punchline, right? The elevator story is in most cases just breathtakingly banal, but my goodness, was it methodologically rigorous. And here, and some of my viewers have seen this, have heard me mention this word before. It's not my term. It's Robert Sternberg, who used to be the former president of APA.
I know it.
Oh, there you go. So his term is methodological fixation, right? So you become fixated on, you have the hammer, and therefore you apply the hammer. And so in the context of consumer psychologists, it's all about mediation and moderation and 3x4x3 design and covariates. And so they become completely myopic about the rigor of their approaches, and they give up the importance of the problem, right? I don't know if you're familiar with this paper. I think it was 1971. It's one that I assigned to my doctoral students, a paper called That's Interesting, right? It was a paper.
Well, I don't know.
Do you know it or you don't know it?
No, I don't. I don't know.
Oh, I'm going to send it to you. I'll send it to you. It's a paper whereby I think he was a sociologist of science, or perhaps a philosopher of science. He was sort of trying his best, not a perfect system, but trying to come up with a set of criteria that would allow someone reading your work, it would elicit the "that's interesting" with an exclamation point. When I read evolutionary psychology stuff, not because I'm biased to evolutionary psychology, but even I think if I were an unbiased observer, almost every paper that I read, it triggers that in me, because the fundamental final effect that is found or phenomenon that is documented is interesting. And I almost never get that in consumer behavior. And again, not because they're any dumber, it's because they're methodologically focused.
Yeah, I think there's another area where I see that, sometimes to my great frustration, is in the neurosciences. Cognitive neuroscience may be getting all the headlines, but not 1 in 10 neuroscientists is a cognitive neuroscientist. And a lot of the non-cognitive ones really look down their noses at the showboaters, the flashy. They're the ones that make the cover of Time magazine and all that, while they're down there in the trenches doing the hard work. And some of them you think, why are you studying the brain? Why don't you study the gallbladder instead? I mean, you don't seem to be interested in what the brain actually manages to accomplish, aside from its metabolism, and they're afraid to venture into any, by their lights, hand-waving functionalistic hypotheses about whether the brain is something other than an organ for cooling the blood, as Aristotle mistakenly thought.
Well, speaking of the neuroimaging paradigm, and I've actually written about this in various academic settings, one of my former professors during my PhD, you might actually know him. His name is Frank Kyle. He's a developmental psychologist. He used to be at Cornell. He's now at Yale.
Yeah.
Do you know him? Okay. So I had taken a year-long cognitive studies course where, of course, we studied linguistics and philosophy and neuroscience and all kinds of stuff related to the study of the mind. So he's got a term that I absolutely love, the illusion of explanatory profundity, right? Mm-hmm. And so what the brain imaging paradigm does in many cases is that, and actually somebody tested this, right? You take the exact same study and you slap on a fancy color brain picture. My God, that looks like serious science. You remove that photo, well, then it seems like it's a bit of post hoc storytelling.
Not only that, but when they did that experiment, by adding the multicolored fMRI images, they presented the article in 2 different versions, with and without images, to graduate students in neuroscience. And the ones who had seen the pretty pictures rated the articles more important and more credible. So there really is a sort of Disney effect there at work.
Beautiful. All right, so let's go back to evolutionary psychology, and how, of course, you're a strong supporter of it, or evolutionary theory in general, and evolutionary psychology in particular. And I think both of us, undoubtedly you more than me, have faced all sorts of detractors. One of the terms that I love from your work is mind creationists. I call them flat earthers of the human mind. And so there are all sorts of cognitive, affective, ideological obstacles that cause otherwise perfectly intelligent and sophisticated people, educated people, to somehow become naturally lobotomized if you introduce the principles of evolutionary theory to the study of the human mind. What is there a way for you to sort of come up with a taxonomy of those reasons, or the types of mind creationists, or how would we navigate through that so that we could better position our arguments so that they could hopefully come to our side?
Well, in a way, that what my new book is attempting to do is just that.
Right.
But I'm too optimistic as usual, and so I'm not going to bother trying to taxonomize. I'm hoping to just talk them out of it so that we don't have to taxonomize them. If I can get them to see that they don't have to drag their feet and they don't have to kick and scream, and life will be good if they just embrace an evolutionary perspective, then we won't have to taxonomize all those who refuse to embrace it.
Well, it seems to me, I mean, I've given it quite a bit of thought. I have a forthcoming paper, which actually I should have probably sent you before we had our chat. It's a paper that looks at the epistemology, the method of EP. How do you build arguments in EP? And that paper was really trying to probably fight against maybe the most irksome of the positions that detractors takes, at least from my perspective, and that's it's all hand waving, just so storytelling. And that one really pisses me off, because that's the one that is most likely to be levied by otherwise intelligent, sophisticated people. So you could have an evolutionary biologist who perfectly accepts using those same mechanisms to study the evolution of the salamander's mating behavior, but take the exact same argument, I changed nothing other than change salamander to human, it becomes utter bullshit, you're hand waving. And so, to me, that's the one that irks me the most, the just so storytelling. Is that yours too, or do you have another one that really gets your blood boiling?
No, that bothers me, of course. I like to put it this way. Every confirmed hypothesis in evolutionary theory, in evolutionary biology, started off as a just so story. You can't do evolutionary biology without just so stories. The thing is, you got to test them. Right. If you just dream them up and let them fly, then that's bad.
Right.
But if you do the proper testing, that's fine. And in most areas, people don't even worry. Not at this late. I mean, simple example. I'm pretty sure that nobody really knows the details of how the flounder's eye gravitated or migrated around so that both of its eyes are on one side of its body, the upside. But I don't think anybody doubts that there's an evolutionary story to be told. I mean, I think that if some ichthyologist were to say, well, the flounders and the soles and the plaice evolved from fish that swam vertically and didn't lie on the bottom, and it was only after they started lying on the bottom that their eyes gravitated like that. I don't think anybody would say, oh, outrageous, outrageous. Well, yeah, there's lots of things we haven't got the details yet. And maybe there will be some really amazing little kinks and twists in those stories. But that there is an evolutionary story to be told is just not in question.
Well, and I would say, I mean, the reason why it irks me the most is because actually the reality is the exact opposite to the accusation that they're levying. And I mean, that's actually one of the main points of that paper that I had written. So I argue, and I actually demonstrate through the use of what are called nomological networks of cumulative evidence, right? If you want to demonstrate that there is that an adaptive position that you're taking, men's preference for the hourglass figure in women is an adaptation, right? So that I could now build this nomological network stemming from incredibly varied and disparate disciplines, from medicine, from physiology, from classics by studying statues from ancient Greece, looking at congenitally blind men who exhibit the same preference. I could put together an incredibly elaborate network of cumulative evidence, not unlike how Darwin originally did in proposing his origin of species argument, right? I mean, he didn't call it nomological networks. And therefore, it's the exact opposite of what you're accusing you of, right? I mean, the evidentiary threshold that a serious evolutionist seeks to achieve before he or she feels comfortable with his adaptive argument is infinitely greater than what is typically considered to be rigorous science, yet we get accused of the exact opposite. That's why I get pissed off.
Well, yeah, but I'm going to put the brakes on in one regard.
Okay.
I was very unhappy with some of the response of some of the evolutionary psychologists to the diatribes that have been leveled against them in recent years, because they were sort of circling the wagons. And very few of them were acknowledging that, as with most other areas of human endeavor, a lot of it was crap. And I think I remember the first time I got really angry about this was at a otherwise wonderful evolutionary psychology meeting in London, where I was just beside myself with joy at a lot of the things that were happening. But there were also maybe a good half a dozen talks, which were inept.
Is this the 2001 UCL HBES?
It may have been, yeah.
Okay, let us hope that one of the 6 talks that you didn't like wasn't the one that I was giving.
No.
Okay.
No.
Oh, oof. Okay, good.
No, I can. I'm quite sure of that.
Okay.
But I do remember I'll just give you one talk. Somebody gave a talk where there was a slide where now all of a sudden the term is escaping my there's a technical term for a graph where everything is binned, and the author of this paper had drawn a curve through the tops of the bins. Although you could have put the bins in any other order, it's the same data. And I thought, come on, if you don't know how to draw your own, well, what's the word I'm looking for? You know.
Yeah, I'm trying to remember, but I'm not sure what you mean.
Well, in any case,
yeah,
if you can't represent the data in your grasp on statistics must be pretty minimal.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Let's go on. Now, this next one, I must admit that it's, of the many sort of suggestions that I receive from people, oh, please talk about this with Dan Dennett. One of the ones that was most frequently mentioned is the free will story. Now, I must admit that I'm not one who has spent a lot of time looking at it. Let me tell you the extent of my knowledge so that you exactly know what I'm coming into this discussion. But I'll actually be asking you a very specific question related to it. So the argument that I've heard, say, from the Sam Harris / Jerry Coyne gang is, well, there is a neurophysiological signature that happens whenever a choice is being instantiated. And then there is a temporal lag prior to you being consciously aware of it. Aha, you don't have free will. The second argument is, well, at any given point time t, whatever is bound to happen is an unfolding reality of a bunch of cause and effect forces that could be explained by natural scientific laws. Ergo, everything is deterministic. There's no free will. Now, and maybe I'm missing something, and you'll let me know what it is. All of the other granular details, I'm not really into. Both of these positions, even if they're true or not, I don't care in terms of arguing for them. Seem to me to be profoundly epistemologically unsatisfying. And so for me, all I care about, and hence that's going to be my question, and the only time that we'll talk about free will, unless you want to talk more about it, is how does the debate of free will, I'm going to ask a very pragmatic question. Does the debate on free will, if Dan Dennett is correct or if Sam Harris is correct, does that alter the way I, as someone who is steeped in empiricism, who wishes to do research, understanding the human mind, would it change anything in how I approach my research?
No, I think it's a good way of getting at the question. I think the answer is no. It's a variation on a question that I always put to people like Jerry Coyne and Sam Harris. I say, well, if you certainly don't exempt yourself, so you don't think you have free will, but tell me, do you think you're competent to sign a contract? Do you think you're competent to make a promise, to take out a loan? If so, then there's some kind of free will that you think you have, and it's the kind that's important. So what's this kind of free will that isn't, that you don't have, and what's the importance of it? That is, what follows from the fact that under rather specialized circumstances, it is possible to predict somebody's decision on the basis of details in their brain. First of all, that in itself, once you start cashing out what the details are, you begin to realize it's a sort of it's a throwaway. Look, I don't even have to look at your brain. I can predict that. If I put a gold bar out on the sidewalk in front of you and let you know that it's a gold bar and it's nobody else's, I'm going to predict you're going to pick it up. Does that show you don't have free will? I don't think so.
Right.
It's a no-brainer.
So then what?
It's a brainer, but the fact that given the state of your brain, the chances of your not picking up the gold bar were negligible doesn't show that you didn't pick it up of your own free will. That's just one tiny part of the answer. But really, I think I provided the key to what's wrong with the line that Sam and Jerry and others take. in a single sentence that I put into my first book on free will, most important sentence in the book, and I made the stupid mistake of putting it in parentheses, and that was, if you make yourself very small, you can externalize virtually everything.
Got it. So if I could rephrase that, because let me see if I understood what you mean by that quote. So in the context of moral arguments, it allows us to externalize culpability. Is that ultimately the ultimate goal of this discussion? Since it doesn't affect how I do science, who cares about having this discussion? Therefore, is that what you're saying?
Well, that's part of it. I mean, somebody wrote a book recently entitled "My Brain Made Me Do It," to which my response is, "Well, who would you want? What would you want to make you do it?"
Right.
I mean, now there's such a thing as not having a good brain and having a diseased brain or a pathological brain, and then you don't have free will. But who says that just because your brain made you do it, that you didn't do it of your own free will? It's got to be the case that you want your brain to make you do these things.
Got it. All right, let's move on. So many more things I'd like to talk to you about. Okay, I think probably three more, because I know you have to leave before 3. Consequentialist versus deontological ethics. Of course, you could give us a quick summary of that. To me, it reminds me of the debate between in personality theory between the radical situationists who argue that there is no such thing as a set personality that Dennett has. It is completely based on how he interacts with the environment. One day he could be extroverted, one day he could be introverted, depending on the demands of the situation. On the other end of that continuum are the guys who are, no, personality is non-malleable, and by certainly age 3, 4, 5, it's set. And then, of course, like many things in life, I think it is really somewhere in the middle where you do have somewhat of a set. Dan might be less extroverted than Gad, but then that could be tweaked, right? The radio lever could be tweaked this way or that way as an interaction with the environment. Is that the same thing in terms of what is considered to be the optimal ethical approach in leading our lives, whereby we could have a set of absolutes, deontological absolutes, but then they are somewhat, there's a norm of reaction depending on the situation. Is that it?
There's something like that. The debate that the philosophers have is importantly removed from reality in order to make it, by the philosopher's vision, a tractable debate. And I think what they're overlooking is that if ethics isn't practical, what is it? I did a paper called "The Moral First Aid Manual," or "What to Do Until the Doctor of Philosophy Arrives," and the title was amusing, but the point was dead serious. If you have an ethical theory which doesn't actually help you figure out what to do, then there's something wrong with your ethical theory. And it's no news to reflective philosophers that you can get deontological ethicists who could who agree on all the empirical facts and disagree profoundly about what the right thing to do is about some ethical issue. And the same goes for consequentialists. The meretricious allure of consequentialism is that it's practical, that we're going to total up the costs and it's cost-benefit analysis. What's wrong with that? But it works fine for things like chess, where there's an end, and either you win or you lose, and then you can work back and you can retrospectively figure out whether this move made checkmate more or less probable, and so you have a measure. But in human ethical decision making, we never know. There's no end game. There's no checkmate that we can use as our standard. My favorite example of this is 3 Mile Island, the near nuclear catastrophe that happened in the United States now many years ago. All right, many years ago. It's had a lot of consequences. Now, as a consequentialist, if you'd been there in the control room, would you have pushed the button to prevent it from happening? Have the consequences been better or worse? And we can't tell yet. We can't tell. So much for consequentialism. And the deontological approach has similar stymieing points. So what we have to do, I think, is recognize that these ethical points are valuable as constraints on acceptable persuasion, but that ultimately what confronts us are political problems, and we have to decide which goals we're going to try to honor and when and how much, and that's the best we can do, but it's good enough.
Gotcha. Two last questions for you. Let's see if we can squeeze them both in before you have to leave at 3. What are your thoughts on all the craziness that's happening on campus with the safe spaces, the trigger warnings, the microaggressions, the political correctness?
I have no sympathy or patience for the trigger warnings, this hyper solicitousness. What I tell my students is, if I don't sort of shock you or offend you in this course, I'm not doing my job. Why are you here if not to be shaken out of some of your preconceptions? Hang on and grow up and take it on the chin.
I'm liking you more by the second, Dan.
But having said that, I also think that gratuitous hazing or poking or making fun of people is just awful, and I will condemn it whenever I see it, but I don't think we need rules for that.
Got you. Last question. So one of the things that I see in navigating through the ecosystem of academia is the extraordinary amount of herd mentality. So for example, if I go to my my personal Facebook page, everybody is perfectly in agreement on every single possible political issue. There's almost zero variation, and that simply can't be possible, right? I mean, you just have to expect that on death penalty, some people who are otherwise called academics might agree with it, and others that might not, right? And so because of this lack of intellectual / political diversity, you do get the proverbial echo chamber, where you then get this tribal mindset, so that any issue, I mean, you may hate, for example, Donald Trump, and you may think he's a bad outcome and bad consequences to the United States, but this idea of nuanced thinking is completely lost. I, on the other hand, will often weigh in. I don't know how much you follow my positions, but I'm somebody who weighs in very forcefully, many times putting me at odds with my colleagues, not so much because I necessarily support the opposite position, and not to be frivolously contrarian, but rather because what drives me is, if you'd like, the integrity of the pursuit of truth, right? The aesthetics of truth. Don't be a hypocrite. Be honest in your arguments. What do you think of that?
No, you've put very well something which has bothered me a lot since the Vietnam War. Back in the 60s, when I was devoting huge percentage of my time and energy, probably too much, but how could it be too much, to trying to stop the war. I was about as passionate about the anti-war movement as you could be, and I never solved the problem of what to do about others who were equally passionate, who were saying really stupid things. And did I button my lip and let them blackmail the rest of us into making claims which I knew were false? Or was I this troublemaker, letting down the side critic who shouldn't be saying these things in public? I think that is one of the great moral problems facing just about everybody today. I dare say there are lots of Republican Congress people, senators and representatives right now, who are losing a lot of sleep over whether they should quietly button their lips and let the Trump administration do some of the things it's doing. At what point do they have to stand up, let the chips fall where they may, and say no in as loud and forceful a way as they can? I would be astonished if that wasn't true.
Is the reason that people can't do that ultimately is because they're succumbing to our innate proclivity to engage in coalitional thinking? Therefore, I'm a member of the blue team, and therefore I will go to the death supporting every argument of the blue team, for I could not concede one to the right team. Is that as simple as that?
I don't think so. You may be right, but my view is that this is a perplexity. This is a difficulty that arises in the most completely dispassionate and rational circumstance. That is, take a bunch of rational angels who are doing battle, a public relations battle, not war, but we're trying to persuade a difficult to persuade majority not to go ahead with something. If some of their members are using dubious tactics, are using rhetoric which is probably counterproductive, are simply making up stuff, what do? Even if you're on the side of truth, can you button your lip and let falsehoods fly sometimes, because they're more likely to support truth in the end? I don't think there are easy answers to those questions.
I guess we'll end it on this very open-ended question. A real pleasure. Stay on the line. A real pleasure and a true honor. Thank you so much for coming on the show, Dan.
I really enjoyed talking with you.
Likewise. Thank you so much, Dan. Stay on the line.